President Obama has just met with four luminaries of the American security establishment. Former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, and former Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee Sam Nunn. These folks have been championing for several years now an absolutely lunatic idea that the United States will be well advised and well served to pursue a nuclear-free world. I'm afraid this, on the face of it, is not true, and that the pursuit of this idea, which is a practical matter, will have the effect of perpetuating the American government's policy of now 17 years duration of unilaterally exercising restraint with respect to the maintenance, let alone the modernization of our nuclear forces, will give rise to a world in which perhaps the United States is denuclearized, but none of the powers that we're worried about, none of the threatening nations that are either now in the nuclear weapons business or getting into it, will in fact be disarmed as well. The President's meeting, from which he takes great comfort as he pursues this goal of what's known as Global Zero, comes against the backdrop of the renewal of arms control negotiations between the United States and Russia. As Mark Thiessen said in the Wall Street Journal, it's sort of the return of the dinosaurs, this idea that that's really the problem, is the balance between the United States and Russia. It's a throwback to the Cold War, of course, but it has very little bearing on the real nuclear threats that we're facing today. The idea that is being pursued, however, in these arms control negotiations is to extend the old START treaty, now about to expire at the end of this year. And the Russians are determined to use the administration's clear ambition to get that extension done so as to preserve certain verification rules, but also to make significant further changes in our nuclear forces, a goal that the Russians are only too happy to collaborate in, provided that they can actually insist on terms that will seriously disadvantage the United States and make this whole exercise even more not only antiquated, but really out of touch with reality. What are the Russians seeking, or what is Rose Gottmuller, the U.S. negotiator, proposing? Well, they include things like the following. They're proposing, we understand, to make dramatic further cuts in the number of nuclear forces we have, from something like 2,200 deployed weapons to perhaps as few as 1,500. That would be about a third reduction in a force that arguably is inadequate today. Inadequate in the sense that it is obsolescent, that it needs very much to be modernized. It needs to have safety improvements made, none of which, of course, is happening in the spirit of not interfering with our pursuit of Global Zero. We're also hearing that the Russians want to have conventional forces, that is to say forces that don't have any nuclear weapons on them at all, but might use launch vehicles or delivery platforms that have been associated with nuclear weapons. They want those captured in this new START follow-on treaty as well. And we're being told that there will be counting rules and the arcana of arms control that will almost certainly be used to the disadvantage of the United States and the advantage of the Russians. Perhaps worst of all, the Russians are saying that they'll only agree to this new START treaty if the United States agrees to terminate its planned deployment of a very modest missile defense system in Eastern Europe, Polish and Czech territories specifically. What that would mean, especially if it comes as part of a larger effort on the part of the Russians to reintegrate some kind of restrictions on missile defenses with limitations on offensive forces. Again, a classic attribute of the now completely antiquated Cold War model is that we will find ourselves unable to provide protection to our European allies against grave and growing threats from, for example, Iran. And in so doing, we will be denied the possibility of having defensive systems that may also protect the United States from missiles launched from that quarter, or perhaps coming westward from North Korea. These are the sorts of capabilities that it should not be up to the Russians to determine whether we can have. They're clearly needed, and it is, I think, the height of folly and downright irresponsible of the Obama administration in its headlong pursuit of a strategic arms follow-on agreement to begin once again allowing our strategic defensive capabilities as well as our offensive capabilities to be subjected to the Russians' veto. A related point has been brought up in a rather unfriendly column written by Michael Crowley in the New Republic. Michael Crowley takes to task those of us who have been warning for some time about the threat of electromagnetic pulse. This is a phenomenon that's been known about for decades. Both the Russians and the Americans have experimented with it in the past. The Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and others have been quite aware that if you detonate a nuclear weapon in space, it can create a powerful electromagnetic pulse, and that anything within line of sight of that pulse that has not been shielded against it can be damaged. Electronic devices specifically, electrical grids and all of the infrastructures that they power. Now, this isn't, of course, a matter that is simply my say-so versus Michael Crowley's say-so. Michael Crowley dismisses the problem, or certainly downplays it. He listens to people like Joseph Cirincione, who have long assured us that we really don't need to worry about our nuclear forces. We certainly don't need any missile defense, and now he's apparently suggesting that electromagnetic pulse is not as much of a danger as I'm suggesting it is. A blue ribbon commission, impaneled by the Congress, has produced a series of reports that have, in fact, come to the conclusion that a detonation of such a nuclear weapon over the United States would have a, quote, catastrophic, unquote, effect on this country. That it would indeed severely damage, if not destroy, parts of our electrical grid and thereby afflict upon us a cascading takedown of other infrastructures that depend on electricity. Who are the people who were on this commission? They were among the most eminent nuclear physicists, the most knowledgeable, the most experienced in the nuclear weapons business, not only in this country, but I suggest to you in the world today. So when one poo-poos this problem, when one tries to pretend that, well, just sort of minor adjustments should be contemplated, I think one is doing a grave disservice to the American people, as frankly is the President of the United States, who suggests that missile defense and more generally our nuclear deterrent are not as important today as they have been in the past, and that in the future we can dispense quite blithely with both. It's not so. And I think this is time for a serious debate about the wisdom of further cuts in our nuclear forces, further deferral of any modernization or testing of our nuclear forces, let alone the substantial reduction, or perhaps under some new arms control treaty with the Russians, effective elimination of our missile defenses. I hope you'll participate in that debate.